I've read a good few vampire books in the past, and even though this was written in 1975, which is basically almost 50 years ago now. Is that right? 50 years ago. Ouch. Even though this book was written about 50 years ago, it still felt to me like a fresh take on the genre. The vampires in this book are not seductive and sexy like Bram Stoker's Dracula, and they're not, you know, insert Twilight joke here. I know what you are. Say it out loud. Shiny. The vampires in Salem's Lot are much more monstrous. You're going to find more similarities between classic zombies than you would with classic vampires, I think. These are creatures. And the more I read about the vampires in Salem's Lot, the more I felt like if vampires existed in our world, this is how they would be. They felt authentic. They felt believable, and that made them much more scary to me. As is always the case with Stephen King, he's got a cast of characters. All of them are complex, they're interesting, except for maybe Ben Mears, who unfortunately is the main character. He's a writer coming back to his hometown, and he's confronting his past, where he spent his childhood in the Marston house at the top of the hill that overlooks the town. You've also got Susan Norton, who was very likable. She serves as the kind of love interest in the story for Ben Mears. And that relationship brings some warmth and some humanity to an otherwise pretty bleak story. And then you've got Mark Petrie, who, I love this kid. I love this kid. Mark is a big horror comic fan. He's a big fan of vampire lore. And although he's terrified of the situation in some places, he's also living out his fantasy of becoming like a little baby Van Helsing. The thing I've really loved about Mark Petrie is that it feels as though, because he's such a big fan of monsters and the lore behind them, he has been preparing for this moment for his whole life. He's gathered up all this expertise about vampires. Really, they couldn't have picked a worse place to come, because here is Mark Petrie, this little lunatic. He is naive enough to believe that things are going to work out, and because he's looking at it through kind of childlike eyes, he takes risks that maybe adults and the other characters in the main cast wouldn't really be so eager to take. Then you've got Father Callahan, who was a fascinating character, one of my favorite characters in the book. I couldn't help but feel as though he was maybe underutilized. I would have personally liked to have seen more of Father Callahan in this book. But yeah, he's really great. He is a Catholic priest who is struggling with his faith. He's really carrying this kind of heavy guilt around as this new danger comes into his town and threatens his Christian flock, and he just feels as though maybe he's not equipped to protect the flock, and so that's given him some guilt and encouraging him to take action. Really fascinating character, and yeah, I just would like to have seen a little bit more of Father Callahan. The main villains in this book are Richard Straker and Barlow. Is it just me, or is Barlow a really rubbish name for a vampire? I mean, to me, Barlow, it screams town drunk. You know, if I'm assigning names to characters, Barlow is the town drunk, or Barlow is the goofy uncle. He's not the vampire. Didn't like the name. And normally Stephen King is so good with character names. Barlow. I found the writing style of Salem's Lot to be so immersive. I don't know if this is something that is common, maybe you do this as well, but when I read books, I listen to music, And with this book, I was listening to ambient, creepy music that I found on YouTube. I can't remember which video it was. Sometimes I listen to something that has a title like, "You're lost in a dark void and will never escape," you know, and it's just 8 hours of ambient sounds. And I was listening to this kind of thing as I was reading, Salem's Lot, and it just kind of took me back to when me and all my mates back when I was a little kid would all tell each other ghost stories and freak each other out. I was loving it. Although the writing is immersive, the language is pretty straightforward, I would say, but I don't mind that because the imagery is vivid. I think some people would think that the pacing is slow, but for classic horror, I think it's, if not necessary, I think it's preferred for me. I like a nice slow burn. I like to spend enough time to build up the suspense, make me fall in love with the characters, make me understand the characters so that I can love the characters, so that I can fear for the characters. I want to care about what happens to these people. And so, yeah, the slow burn, I don't mind it. I think I'm a slow burn kind of guy. I love the themes that are explored in this book. You've got ancient, supernatural evil versus everyday human evil that could just happen in any small town in the world. You've got the loss of innocence of Susan Norton and especially of Mark Petrie. And then you've got the crisis of faith, as I mentioned, of Father Callahan. That, to me, those scenes with Father Callahan were so heavy. Another thing that I think Stephen King really likes to play with in a lot of his books is the fear of the unknown. I spoke about that in my review of The Mist. This is a lot of fun to play with, I think, the fear of the unknown specifically, because the town are able to just turn a blind eye to this rising danger that is just slowly rising, and they keep turning a blind eye to it, pretending that everything's okay, pretending that nothing's happening until it's too late. And I think that that's something that in many forms a lot of us can really relate to. Okay, so this is the point of the review where I'm going to start talking about spoilers. I'm actually going to talk about my favorite scenes and why they stuck with me so much. So if you haven't already read the book, this is where I would say go read the book, maybe think about subscribing to the channel, and then you can come back and we can talk about our favorite scenes in the book. Let's start off with Danny Glick's funeral. I think one of the things that this book does really well is how it handles grief. At the funeral, you've got Danny Glick's mother who is just crying silently, just shuddering. And then you've got Danny Glick's father who is still in denial about the whole thing. And he kind of, in the middle of the funeral, just wakes up to the situation, realizes that he's at his son's funeral, his little boy's funeral. And he kind of has a bit of a meltdown. He runs over to the coffin and he says, now, get up, Danny. Get up. Stop joking around. Get out of the coffin. Come on, son. Wake up. And when that happened, like, I really felt that. And then afterwards, when they're both home and now they're kind of like empty nesters, I guess you'd call them. And they're both home alone. And as a way to distract each other, they decide that what they're going to do is make love. And then they just both start crying and just holding each other. Every single element of their life is consumed by grief. There is no way to distract themselves from that. Heartbreaking, felt really real. Other favourite scenes were basically any scene with Mark Petrie in it. I loved. The classic one is obviously when Danny Glick, as a vampire, arrives at Mark's window. Such classic horror, let me in, scary. Not just because of the supernatural element, but also because, Mark Petrie's a little kid. But other than that, when the school bully, Richie, tries to dominate Mark, and Mark just wrecks this kid, no respect. And then when Straker ties him up and leaves him hanging as a feast for the boss man, Petrie escapes, picks up a bat, Straker comes back in, bang, crack across the back of the head, no respect. And then the lowest moment of Mark's little life, he sees Barlow take out his parents, and then when Barlow tries to have his big moment, and he tries to give his big bad guy speech, "We'll meet again, young man. And next time," Mark's like, spits in his face, ruins his big moment, no respect. This kid doesn't show anyone any respect. And I can respect that. Another scene I really loved is when Father Callahan's faith fails him when he's face to face with the vampire. And I'm not really like a religious person, but I know that a lot of people find great strength in their religion. And so when Father Callahan enters the situation, he has a certain amount of confidence because he knows that God has his back until he doesn't. The dread that washes over him when his faith fails him, like I could feel the weight of that, the devastation of that. And I think it's a really great example of how horror is able to examine deeper themes. It's not all just blood and guts and gore. There's some of that, but it's not just that. Then all of the scenes where Jimmy and Mark are going around the town during the day and they're kind of taking advantage of the daylight to go vampire hunting. And this felt so eerie. This is the scene that really stuck with me for some reason. Do you remember the bit where there's a family of vampires that are all hiding underneath the crawl space of their home? And I think it's Jimmy that drags out the dad of the family, and his skin starts to sizzle under the daylight, and he just lazily and clumsily crawls himself. He sort of moans and crawls back into the crawl space. Ugh. That's what I'm saying. These vampires feel as though they could exist in nature. Like this is an affliction that could affect you and me. And it was disgusting, and I loved it. The scene where Susan becomes a vampire and Ben is forced to drive a stake through her heart. This was actually shocking to me. I did not see this coming, honestly. I thought Susan was going to be one of the people that made it. It's not even as if she was taken out in the climax. It was just before the climax. I would say about the 75% mark. And their relationship was so sweet, so light, that it felt devastating, something really hard for Ben to have to do. And again, I kind of like it when things like this happen, because it shows that there's no plot armor. No one is guaranteed to survive this. I started to fear for the other characters when Susan was taken out of the game. It was shocking. And talking about characters being taken out of the game, what about Jimmy? The way that Jimmy was ended was just so sudden and out of the blue. And he didn't go in a kind of supernatural way like Susan did. His death was much more gritty, right? A little trap they've carved away at the stairs. By the way, the mechanics of that, like who set that trap? I would have loved to have been in the room when that was happening. Who's that? Barlow? Barlow's like, hey, can you pass me a saw? Now this is a hacksaw. This isn't going to work. I need one for timber. That's right. Yeah, that'll do. You know, like, is that happening? Like, that seems a bit unusual. But yeah, putting that aside for 1 second, the way that Jimmy just stepped and then falls down into the trap and gets impaled. Yo! And then Mark sees it. That's gritty, man. That's a bad way to go. And let me say this as well. With this book, this is the best ending of any Stephen King book that I've ever read. And I know I've spoken in the past about how sometimes open endings don't satisfy. This was an open ending, but I could very clearly imagine a world in which Ben and Mark travel around all these small towns in America posing as father and son, but are secretly vampire hunters. And that is metal. Okay, ratings. The plot, I'm going to give 4.5 stars out of 5. It was slow in places, but there were just so many great scenes that built up to this great climax and this final battle. You know, I've got to rank it high. Not perfect, but as close to perfect as you can get. Characters, I'm gonna have to give it a 3 out of 5, unfortunately. Like I say, Mark Petrie, really liked him. Father Callahan, really liked Father Callahan. But the villains were a little bit one-dimensional, honestly. And Ben Mears wasn't the most interesting main protagonist. So, you know, it suffers because of that. 3 out of 5, not bad. The setting, 5 out of 5, easy. I think Stephen King, once again, has blended realism with an eerie kind of an atmosphere, and it's just the perfect backdrop for horror. Originality, this is my favorite vampire book that I've ever read, but it does rely quite heavily on existing vampire lore, so yeah, I can't give it 5 out of 5. So 3 out of 5 for originality, and overall, I'm gonna give it 4.5 stars out of 5. This is owed to the atmospheric storytelling, a kind of a new take on vampires, where they're a lot more beastly, and also scenes that are just going to stick with me long after I've read the book. Was it better than The Stand? It's as good as The Stand. Is it better than The Stand? Do you know what I'm going to do? When I'm done reading the Multiverse of the Dark Tower, I'm going to go back and I'm going to put all of these books in order of how much I like them. Salem's Lot's going to be up there. The Stand's going to be up there. I can't distinguish between the two at the moment in how much I enjoyed them. Speaking of the Dark Tower, I'm currently reading my way through the Multiverse of the Dark Tower. In total, it's 24 books, and this is Salem's Lot is book 9, and the next book is going to be It. It's a classic, right? Look at the size of it, though. That's intimidating, ain't it? Anyway, if you'd like to see my review of It and my reaction to it, then you can click up here. Thanks so much for watching. Happy reading. I'll see you next time.